My name is Allison Felis, and this is I'll Follow You, a podcast featuring light and lively conversations about film, music, and creative culture, coming to you from the People's Republic of Rogers Park on the far northeast side of Chicago. So, as soon as I started this podcast project, I knew with absolute certainty that I had to have today's guest on, preferably sooner rather than later. I'm absolutely thrilled not just to have him on for this wonderful chat, but also to be able to introduce him and his work to those of you who may not have had the pleasure of knowing him yet. Today, I'm so excited to welcome to the show Dr. Gene Kannenberg Jr. Gene is a cartoonist living in Evanston, Illinois. His comics, mostly abstract with Asemic Writing, include Qodèxx, Space Year 2015, and the Abstract Circus. His work was included in the Minnesota Center for Book Art's 2017 exhibit Asemic Writing, Offline and in the Gallery, and also appears in the book Abstraction, bande, dessinée, produced by the ACME Comics Research Group at the University of Liège in Belgium. Gene received his PhD from the University of Connecticut in 2002, and he has served in the past as chair of both the International Comic Arts Festival and the Comic Art and Comics section of the Popular Culture Association. His book, 500 Essential Graphic Novels, was published by Collins Design in 2018. Gene is currently the Research and Media Assistant at the Melville J. Herskovits Library of African Studies at Northwestern University, where he has curated 2 exhibits on comic art. As we allude to later in the conversation, Gene moved to Illinois in late 2014, and it was one of those rare examples of a later in life just instant friendship. Just like, yep, you're my people. He had gone to grad school with my partner, Brian Kremens, whom we also allude to later in the conversation. And pretty much just from the moment he signed the lease on his apartment, he was showing up at our gigs and just taking the best photographs of us playing music and inviting us out to excellent readings and film screenings and just being a really key part of our urban family. We all together, the 3 of us, collaborated on a modern take on the book and record set with Gene's project Qodèxx, an abstract graphic novella for which Brian and I composed the soundtrack. And if this sounds insane and confusing, don't worry, we'll describe it a bit more in depth later, and I'll link out to it in the show notes as well. So pardon all the giggles and excited blathering that you're going to hear from me here. It really does just come from a place of extreme warmth and affection for Gene and our friendship, and of course my enthusiasm for his work. So now, to let him speak more for himself, here's my conversation with Gene Kannenberg. So, Dr. Kannenberg, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
So I was joking before. It's like, Dr. Kannenberg, this is your life.
Oh God, who's going to come out on stage and freak me out?
It's going to be one of the gremlins from like the video games that you used to play. So yeah, I mean, I'm sort of joking, but also sort of not that, yes, you are not used to being on this side of the microphone, because for many years you were a co-host on the Comics Alternative podcast, and probably were there other shows that you worked on?
Not really. That was pretty much the only one. I don't think I've ever done anything else that way.
But you were very much in the interviewer capacity,
oh, yeah.
You know, reading stuff and being the one asking the questions, and so now you're on the other side.
Now I know what it feels like. Oh Lord,
to have the spotlight directly in your face. So, I mean, one of the big reasons that I wanted to have you on to talk, I mean, other than, you know, the fact that we're good pals, and I know you're a good talker, and we'll have interesting things to say, but I really do find the trajectory of you know, I don't even want to call it your career. I mean, because it's even more than your career in a lot of ways. Just the fact that you sort of started in academia as one of the OG comic scholars that sort of I think people really don't realize that, like, comic scholarship kind of, not that it wouldn't exist, but it would exist in a different way were it not for the work that you did and sort of the, you know, the path that you cleared for a lot of the younger comic scholars. So you're kind of a big deal, as they say. And then, then there was like a whole bunch of life happened, and now suddenly you're this lauded artist too, that you've been giving artist talks, and you're really well regarded for the Asemic comics that you've been producing the past couple of years. And just getting from point A to point B, I feel like is an interesting conversation to have.
Yeah. I think I go from A to B, but I move my way through Q and pi also.
But that therein lies the fascination. But so before we get to sort of the nitty gritty of how that all came to be, I mean, do you want to give people a little bit of background on how you would define yourself now and the work that you're doing right now?
How I define myself now? I work in a library. I'm in library school, but I am also a cartoonist in my mind and I guess in my downtime from work and school. It took me several years to be able to say I am a cartoonist with any sort of comfort because, again, like you said, I was studying and writing about comics for about 20 years before I started really drawing seriously myself. And I have so many friends who are legit amazing cartoonists, like world-class cartoonists. And for me to use that same word to talk about myself was not the most comfortable thing. It was a little, not even imposter syndrome, just like I'm not there yet. But enough has happened that I guess I am there enough, if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely makes sense. It reminds me of one of my favorite musical artists that I love, Dan Snaith, who records as Caribou, and he talks about using his voice as a vocalist. And he started off as a drummer, and now does a lot of like dance music, like programmed dance music, electronic music, and he was like, "Look, I'm not Sam Cooke, okay?" And he was like, so he was like, it's the same thing. He's like, it's weird for me to say I'm a singer. He was like, but, my vocals serve a purpose in the music that I do. And that's just, they just are what they are, And so it's weird that there's not a separate word for what I do, but so I get where you're coming from. Yeah.
Cartoonist manqué.
So, well, just before we get into, again, this sort of road that led you here, I mean, do you want to talk a little bit more about your cartooning work? And it's sort of weird to describe things, but we'll put links in the show notes and everything so that people can go look at your stuff. But would you like to talk a little bit about what your practice looks like now?
Okay. I draw abstract-ish and asemic. I draw abstract-ish comics using asemic text. Asemic text is text that looks like text, but it doesn't actually mean anything. So I have a couple different. Almost every other word here is going to be like in brackets or quotation marks. I have a few different alphabets that I use, and they all have kind of a unifying aesthetic form to them, but they are just bunches of characters. They're bunches of marks that I like to make in a series that look as if they should mean something, but they mean absolutely nothing. There's no substitution code, no anything like that. I've got a couple of patterns that I follow, but other than that, there's nothing. And the comics themselves are abstract. I'm interested in page layout, I guess, more than. Here's how it happened. I wanted to make comics because I admire the form so much, but I don't feel like I'm a storyteller, and I don't know how to draw. At least I didn't feel like I know how to draw representationally at all. So I made a virtue of necessity, and started making comics as if a Martian saw Earth comics, but then used their own symbology systems to make stuff that just happened to follow the grammar of what Earth comics look like.
So you're basically like the tentacle creature from Arrival making comics, right?
That I wish I could make comics that look that cool, but yeah. My thought process is often circular, and my compositions are also kind of circular sometimes too. So there we go.
So landing on Asemic and abstract comics, I mean, you sort of protest that you say you're not, you don't feel like you're up to making the level that you would want to make as a comics artist in the way that, other people that you admire. But so how did you get from how did you get to Asemic Comics? I mean, where did you pick up on that and thought like, oh, this is my way in?
We're going to jump back about 10 years ish. Around 10 years ago, I had a really crappy telephone polling job. Basically, I was calling people on behalf of Verizon to ask them about their latest service experience. It was hell. It was the worst job you could possibly have. Well, maybe not. I mean, there are worse things, but it was really just mind-numbing. And you couldn't take a break until the computer let you and all this kind of stuff like that. So you were just kind of stuck in this little cubicle. And I started to go a little nuts. And we could have paper and pen with us to like take notes and stuff. So one day I just started doodling something, and I just because comics is just like a second language that I read all the time. I started putting things in boxes, and it was nothing representational. It was just stuff. And when I got done with the first one, I looked at it and said, "That looks kind of comics-like, but it doesn't mean anything." And I was literally just making marks on paper to try to keep my sanity. And so I didn't really know at the time about abstract comics or Asemic writing at all. That stuff came much later. And I did a few of those for a while, and then I stopped. And then over the course of the next few years, I would do like maybe a tiny little thing once every 6 months or even longer than that. Honestly, just not doing much at all. And eventually I had a roommate who was a graphic designer and artist herself. And she kept pushing me. She said, "You should do more of these. You should do more of these." And I was like, yeah, I should. But then I didn't for the longest time. And then one night I just made this decision. I'm going to try to make something that looks like a comic. And I had a piece of regular paper. I had a bunch of markers and pencils, and I had a nice glass of whiskey. And
the most important component, right?
Yeah. And I just started drawing, and it was interesting. And I was trying to be really, how to say it? I was trying to be really certain about drawing things that made no sense. I was trying to be very deliberative about what I was doing. Like I started with like a line that kind of squiggled across the paper. And I just said, whatever I'm doing here, I want your eyes to move in this direction. And that's something that I learned from the cartoonist Steve Bissett, who, to go back up to the UConn days, he would come down once or twice a year to speak to Professor Tom Roberts' comics class. And Steve is a master at talking about his own craft. I know a lot of artists on a lot of different, whether they're visual artists or musicians or whatever, sometimes they can be really great about talking about other people's work and deconstructing it, or at least trying to explain how it works and how it's really interesting. But then to talk about their own stuff, it becomes much harder for them. Steve is somebody who is equally eloquent about other people's work and his own. And
Steve's incredible. Like the little bit that we're friended to each other on Facebook, and just his posts are always consistently enlightening. So I can't imagine being in that kind of classroom setting with him too. Must be just like really amazing.
Yeah, his students at the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont are really lucky. But anyway, so one of the things he talked about was trying to lead your eye across the page, and so that's always in my mind whenever I'm drawing anything. Where's the eye going to go next? Because for me, it's about keeping you on the page rather than telling a specific story. I want you to be taking in certain things in certain ways. That's about as concrete as I can get.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting and really an important distinction to make, because I think, like the sort of old straw man argument, like, well, my kid could do that. That's just doodling. And it's not. It's definitively not what you're doing. But it's also like, how do you explain like what it is that you're doing? And I think that intentionality, I think that's a really good way of sort of like defining sort of the sandbox that you're in.
Yeah. I forgot where this question started.
That's okay. It's a good story. I mean, I guess I was asking you sort of where the impulse towards the
Right.
Asemic work came from. Yeah.
Yeah, and eventually, when I started doing this stuff sort of on the regular, I had heard of abstract comics. I knew they existed, but once I started to become kind of serious about this, for like the first 6 months, I purposely didn't look at anything that could potentially be anything like I was doing because I was just really in exploratory mode. But now I do know a lot more about the history of abstract comics and Asemic writing and things like this. I've, I'm looking at a couple new books on my bookshelf just on Asemic writing that I haven't yet read. So I'm trying to think more analytically about not necessarily where I fit into all this stuff, but what's come before, what types of things have been done, and when I try something, I'm either working with or against something else that's come before, or just I still haven't heard anybody doing anything like this, so I'm going to try this and see what happens.
Yeah, and your stuff it's really mind-blowing. I mean, I recommend that everyone who's listening to this who hasn't had the pleasure of checking out Gene's artwork, like I said, we'll have links in the show notes, but his work is really spectacular, and it's not it sounds, in saying asemic and abstract and whatever, it sounds like it could be really cerebral, and it is, but it's so approachable, and it's so friendly, and it invites narrativization without needing it in order to generate pleasure. It's like you said, it's not a cipher. It's not like trying to get you to substitute something for it. And I love, as we can talk more about your novella Qodèxx a little bit later. But that's been one of the joys, is that like people come up to you and tell you, well, this is what it means, right? And you're kind of like, sure. So like you must have heard like how many variations with utter certainty of like what that story is, right?
Oh yeah, it's been used in at least one classroom as a textbook in a comics course, which blew my mind when that happened. I did a Skype in with the class, and basically all the students' questions boiled down to, tell us what this means. And I could not and would not. And I think they were a little frustrated with that sometimes, and I could understand that frustration. But I honestly, except for a couple little places, there's no real narrative intentionality whatsoever. It was more about pleasing shapes and keeping things consistent and mixing things up.
Well, and so I think this is a perfect bridge into talking about, so, your work was taught in a classroom, and at one point you were the one teaching in a classroom. So do you want to give just a little capsule backstory of the early days, the origin story of Gene Kannenberg, and as far as in comic scholarship?
Okay, I read comics when I was a little kid. I gave them up. I started reading again in high school. I gave them up. Read them in college. Gave them up. Went to grad school, and eventually they kind of came back, and then they haven't gone away. And I was doing a lot of reading about reading comics and discovering a couple books about them. But when I was in graduate school at the University of Connecticut, which is where I met Brian Cremens, but I also met several other people as well. And the most important was Charles Hatfield, who is now like a huge name in comic scholarship and children's literature. And we were actually at a party at a faculty member's house. This was like my first or second year that I was there. And the faculty member's significant other had the Smithsonian Book of comic book comics on his shelf. And somehow when you're at a party, you don't know too many people, you tend to look at the bookshelves if people have books. And Charles and I were kind of doing the same thing, and we pulled this out, and it was just like, it's like the scene in the Blues Brothers where the sun comes through the church window. And it was really interesting, and the two of us started talking. Gene's friend came over to talk also. And then Charles and I, at that point, he was doing 18th century literature, and I was a medievalist. I was there to study Old English literature, Anglo-Saxon. And we started talking about comics. Charles had read more widely than I had. And we started going back and forth, talking about things, trading books, and eventually our conversations went from wasn't it cool when to isn't it interesting how?
Mm.
And there was that. And then we discovered that there were conferences where you could do this sort of thing. People could write about comics like you would write about literature. And again, that's really reductive. But there was only a few books that really looked like they were academic books that talked about comics.
Because I think that now, I mean, I just want to like emphasize like what a big deal this was like at the time. Because I think now, people obviously don't think twice about like, oh, I read Mouse as an undergraduate or whatever, like studying comics in the college classroom. But like at the time, the fact that you guys would be writing about this seriously was still really pretty cutting edge stuff.
It was unfathomable to a lot of people. I didn't get a ton of actual pushback. It was just a lot of people, just like faculty members, just shaking their heads, going, "Yeah, whatever, I guess." But we were really lucky that there were faculty that kind of let us do what we wanted to do, along with the real work. But eventually, the comics kind of became the real work. But Charles and I and a guy named Kevin Cahill, who shared the office that I was in at the time, who was also a comic book guy. We put together this panel because we decided that we'd heard that comic scholarship existed, or that people talked about comics at conferences, and we had gone to one or two that just were not good. At least I remember Kevin and I were at the same one. And these people were just talking about things that just it was basically fans saying, "Isn't this cool? Isn't this cool?" And we're like, "There's a lot more you can do there." And so the three of us decided we were going to go. We submitted a panel to the Northeast Modern Language Association conference, or the New England, whatever. Yeah, I think it's the New England Modern Language Association. And we put together this panel where we're going to talk about the images as well as the text, and we're going to tell these people what they were going to do. And this is how you do it, because we know the right thing. And it's not that we were wrong. It's just that at least on my part, I was pretty naive. But anyways, that conference was a disaster because they wound up putting 3 more people on our panel. And so there were 6 people at the front of the room and 4 people in the audience, one of whom was Kevin's brother, and another one of whom was Kevin's brother's friend.
So I've played gigs like that. I know how that goes.
The whole thing was nuts. I mean, when we get there to sign in, to register, the organizer's there, and he's like, "Here's the here's the program." I didn't bother to run spell check because a lot of people's names are just strange, so there's going to be some mistakes. Okay.
What?
Yeah. It was just like and like there were all these panels, too many panels at the same time with too many people on them, so there was never any audience for any panel at all. It was just the dumbest thing ever. So the 3 of us were like, that one doesn't count. We got to try this again. So we went to the National Popular Culture Association, and that was where we met a lot of people who would go on who were either at the time doing really important work or who would soon be doing really important work. And Charles and I kind of kept going. Kevin eventually moved on after his master's program. But we met up with other people at UConn also who were doing some of the stuff, like Wendy Goldberg, who's doing manga stuff, Kate Laity, who's doing a lot of interesting stuff also. And we just started doing more academic stuff about comics. But again, I started a research website, which eventually became called comicsresearch.org, just because I was tired of rebuying books that I already owned. So I decided I was going to make a list of all the books that I had so I could refer to it. And I was like, well, if I'm going to do it, I could put it on this new thing called the internet, because this was like
nice.
This was like 1993, 1994.
Awesome.
It was pretty new at the time, and it kind of grew beyond just my collection, just because I spent a lot of time on the site. But when I first started it, it was almost possible to have every book, at least in the English language, that was written about comics to fit on not even in one bookcase, but maybe 1 or 2 bookshelves of a bookcase.
Wow.
And that is certainly not what it is today. But so we were starting from not ground zero, because there are people like John Lent or how am I blanking on these names? Well, Amy Nyberg, Joseph Rusty Wittick,
Inge.
Tom Inge. That's who I was reaching for. Yeah, and other people who had been doing things before. And were continuing to do things. I mean, Rusty and Amy were still fairly new. Rusty's book had just come out a couple of years ago called Comic Books as History. And that was like a huge game changer for me. And Amy's book came out a couple of years after that about the Comics Code. And so we met all these people, and it just became really exciting. And it became something that you could do. And so this kind of community sort of grew up around comics. No matter what conference you would go to, you would see some of the same people, which is kind of what conferences are like. But most of us started off as precocious graduate students, but most of that group now is all tenured professors all over the country who have been, like you said, using comics in their courses. He said now almost everybody who's comes up, at least half people have read Mouse already, sometimes even in high school.
Right.
At the time, there were very few comic books that were ever like taught in university classroom one way or another. At UConn, Professor Tom Roberts had been teaching it was a special topics course, so it probably doesn't count as one of the very first comics courses, but it should. Because it was a special topics course in comics that he was teaching. I don't know when it actually started, but he was doing it once a year, once Charles and I started the stuff. And so he would bring us in to do guest lectures. And first we just started sitting in, but he kind of took us under his wing, and we got to do guest lectures. We brought down Steve Bissett, a lot of other things like that. And it just kind of eventually became, my dissertation was going to be about the marginalia in Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, but the text and image. But the more I wrote, the more I realized I really want to be doing all this other stuff that I'm doing. At this point, Charles and I were on the executive committee of the International Comic Arts Festival because we went to the second one, and the organizer said, "I need a few more people. Would you guys like to be on the committee?" Okay. And so that just,
and that's how it used to happen, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, it was that synchronistic. And Charles got published in the first volume of Inks, and that was a huge deal. Charles and I were also writing for the Comics Journal a lot, which was a popular magazine, but it was had some of the smartest comics criticism at the time. And we were getting paid for it too. Not a lot, but it was actually making a little money. Didn't cover the cost of the comics I was buying, but at least it was something. And so as things have gone, I got to teach. I was teaching some children's literature courses, and I would bring comics into those. I taught one comics course, one actual course just in comics when I was teaching at the University of Houston downtown in the early 2000s. And at that point, I did have one person on the first day of class who got up halfway through and said, "This class is about comics. I thought we were going to talk about comedians." And laughed.
I don't know if you've ever told me that story. That's amazing.
Hand to God. It was like, you figure something like that might happen, but it actually did.
What did he think? I mean, comedy is interesting, but what did he think was going to happen?
I don't know. And the course was called Comics and Visual Literature because they wouldn't let me teach the course without the word literature in the title because comics alone was too scary.
Of course. So, I mean, was it going to be like the film career of Robin Williams or something? I mean,
I think that's what the kid thought. I don't
know. Oh, dear. That's fantastic.
Yeah, that was odd.
So you did that for a long time, and that was a really big deal. And, we don't have to go into the gory details of sort of like the intervening decade or so, but suddenly there was a shift. Like suddenly, you were not teaching anymore and not writing as much about comics, but then clearly this love of comics is so deeply ingrained in you that I love that it just like flowered elsewhere, like for you. Does that seem like an accurate way of describing that?
Yeah, pretty much. It was, I mean, it was in me and it had to come out somehow. And yeah, writing was getting really hard for me, so I wasn't really writing about comics very much at all.
But
But
again, I think it should be said that like your books that you've written are like really significant and were like early early books that were important to the field. So if you want to shout those out just so people are aware of like again like what a big deal you are.
actually, I have no books of my own. Except for a book called 500 Essential Graphic Novels, which is not really my book, anyways. It was work for hire, and that's a whole other story. But I mostly published articles. Well, that's what I did in academia. I published articles on comics lettering, on Art Spiegelman, on Chris Ware. I published the first academic piece on Chris Ware, before people knew who he was. And Winsor McKay, Art Spiegelman, and Chris Ware were my dissertation was about. So I made my name kind of writing articles and things like that.
But like really big deal articles. I mean that people sort of remember and still refer to and are sort of real bedrocks of the discipline.
Well, thanks. But anyways, yeah, I did that, and I wasn't able to do that anymore for all kinds of reasons. But I guess that segues into how I started doing the actual drawing. Again, I said for like a few years I had been drawing like one page or like one squiggle every 6 months or whatever, just feeling what I was, just trying to figure out something, but not really knowing where it was going.
But that's an exaggeration, though, because you had been doing the zine projects. There had been zines that you had been doing in that same period, right?
I had done a few comics. Yeah, in the mid '90s, I was doing like single page comics for my wife at the time. She was doing a zine, and I was doing comics like one page or one page per issue or something like that. And eventually, I had enough that I could put together a little 16-page mini comic of my very own during the '90s, a black and white mini comic, which everybody was doing. So in 1997, Gene's Comics Machine #1 came out.
Remember that name, people. Gene's Comics Machine, yeah, like foreshadowing.
Yeah, that's all. And again, that comes from Gene the Dancing Machine from The Gong Show. You may be too young to know about that.
I'm vaguely aware. It's in the early primordial soup of my awareness. Yeah.
So that kind of collected a bunch of stuff, and I mostly gave copies away. Did some trading through Fact Sheet 5, things like that. So that was my one and only actual like zine type thing that I ever did, just all on my own. And at the time, like I said, I had been writing for the Comics Journal, and I sent a copy to my editor at the time, just as a, hey, check out this weird thing that I did. But again, this was still the early part of the internet, and this was Tom Spurgeon, the late Tom Spurgeon, sadly, who at the time on the Comics Journal website had a section called "You Send It, We'll Review It," where anything he got his hands on, he would review. I forgot about that. So he got it, and one day the review pops up. It starts off, Gene is a academic, blah, 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 blah. Sadly, he's no cartoonist.
Oh, Spurge, come on, Spurge.
Yeah. and then he kind of went, but then he said, he wound up saying nice things about it. He said, it hits all the mini comic autobiography cliches and things like this. And he said, with very limited artistic ability, this kind of begs the question, what can you actually do if you try to do this? And he said, well, actually, the answer is quite a lot. So he was, but it was very backhanded. If there had ever been a Gene's Comics Machine #2, I would have put a big pull quote on the front, even on the cover, even above the title. Sadly, he's no cartoonist. I really wanted to do that, but I have very bad follow through, so I never made more comics after that, and for almost 20 years.
I think the thing you do now, though, is I think you print up business cards like Gene Kannenberg Jr., Qodèxx, Comics Machine. Sadly, he's no cartoonist.
Yeah, no. At first, I was like, "What?" But like within like 3 seconds, it just became hilarious.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome.
It didn't bug me at all, because it was like, well, he's not wrong.
But it's also a way of you were taken seriously. It was like, even though it was a pan, it was also someone legitimately engaging with your work and evaluating it
Oh
from,
yeah,
an objective perspective.
yeah, definitely. There was that, and then the Great Fallow period, and again, those comics were all adapting song lyrics or adapting dreams. The best thing I did in there was The Night I Dreamt It Was Frank Sinatra,
Nice.
which was based on an actual, honest to God, real dream. But because I can't really draw, I was trying to figure out, well, how am I going to represent Frank Sinatra? And there was like this People magazine, I think, that had a story that had like, I think it was a story either about him or about celebrities of a certain age or whatever, but it had photos of him, like a timeline photo, starting from the young crooner up through Vegas, through late Vegas Sinatra. And so I had a 5-panel comic. There were 5 photos there. So each one of those photos became Frank, who was me in the dream in the comic. Frank ages over the course of the comic. I actually pasted down photocopies and drew over them. I mean, like, just really, really raw, stupid stuff, but it was a lot of fun.
That's cool. Do you still have a copy of that?
Oh yeah.
Well, I'm gonna need to see that at some point. We don't have to put that up for the people, but that's gonna, next time we get together for drinks, I'm gonna request that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna, talk more about how you got into doing the daily comics then subsequently. But if there's other stuff you wanted to mention,
I'll go to the daily because I forgot actually what I was about to say. So it either wasn't important or was a lie, as the story goes. So,
it'll come back to you.
Yeah. So, anyways, I moved to the Chicago area in late 2014 for a job at the Herskovits Library of African Studies at Northwestern University. It's awesome. But I moved here like late November of 2014. I knew you and Brian. I had met you.
Well, you barely knew me.
I had met you once before. But yeah, Brian, who I totally skipped over in the whole Yukon thing. That's where Brian and I met.
Well, he always gets described as the junior partner, so it's he came later.
Yeah, but he is also a big deal. Brian's book on Captain Marvel and nostalgia is must reading. It's the most readable academic book I've ever read in my life, and that's not just because I know Brian. It's a beautifully written book. Go buy it. Spend the money.
Plug.
Yeah, but I moved here late 2014. I went to a New Year's Day party, January 1st, 2015. A friend of my brother kind of took pity on me and invited me to a party that he had at an art gallery. And when I was there, his girlfriend at the time asked me, "So, she was just going on people because it's New Year's Day. What are your New Year's resolutions?" And when it got to me, I was like, "I don't make resolutions because I never keep them, but I kind of wish I would draw more." And
dun dun dun.
Yeah. And I went home. I've skipped over an important thing here, but I went home and picked up this brush pen that I'd been given by Coraline Deibler, who's a professor of art at University of Connecticut, who helped me when I was the year before when I had done a couple of pages. She gave me like a 3-hour tutorial on Photoshop. One night, and I had known her a bit when I was still back at UConn, and as a gift she sent me this brush pen, which is just what it sounds like. It looks like kind of like a marker, but it has a brush tip at the end, actual like actual fake horsehair. And I tried it. This was like in early 2014 probably. And it scared the hell out of me. It was like, I don't understand I can't control this. I've never taken an art class. I don't know what this thing is. It just scared me. Anyways, January 1st, 2015, I came home from that party and I said, you know what? Let me try it. Let's see if I can do a comic. And I drew something, again, very, very rough, but in the style that if you want to call it a style that I'd been working on. It was really rough. I had no pen control whatsoever. It's rough and it's messy, but it was a thing. And I said, Maybe I can do one of these every day for a year, and that's my New Year's resolution, which is ridiculous because I've never stuck to any resolution, much less a daily thing. I didn't even work on my dissertation every single day. But I decided, well, I'm going to try one of these every day. And I know that I would have stopped after 3 days because, again, I have usually no follow through. I have very little follow through on things. But what I did was I took a photo of that drawing and I put it on my Facebook page. And I got a lot of comments on it. And again, I had done a couple things the year before, including one which was a version of a Charles Atlas ad, the 98-pound weakling who gets sand kicked in his face. I did a really abstract version of that, which actually got printed in a zine in Houston, which was like, my God, my name in print. That's never going to happen again. That's amazing.
Your name in print as a comics artist, like your name had been in print
as a comics
multiple times before. Yeah.
I was like, that's insane. Look at me. I'm like a cartoonist. But anyway, so I put it up there and I got a lot of good responses on it. And the next day I did the same thing, got more responses. I think it was by the fourth or fifth day, I had turned it into a Tumblr, and I had to have a name for it, and I just went back to Comics Machine. Because I was building these things out of the building blocks of comics, basically. So there's actually a kind of a machine thing on there. I was constructing this stuff out of half remembered images and layouts that I had seen before, things like that.
And that was part of, I think, once you started getting into doing more of those parodies, I think that was also part of the machinery of what made those so fun for people. Because, again, we talked earlier about how there was never an exact correlation with your alphabets or anything, but there were these tribute pieces that you would do, like the Charles Atlas and the Superman front cover for Superman #1, right?
Yeah.
I
did.
What are the other?
So there were I did a Little Sammy Sneeze from Winsor McKay, the artist who did Little Nemo in Slumberland.
Right.
I did a Mobius. I don't call them parodies. I call them homages, but it's whatever you want to say, because again, they follow. There's a Tintin one, and they just followed the layout of the original, but I would substitute stuff and things for actual content. And
they're so fun. I mean, because you did the classic Who, which Who album was
right.
it?
No, that's the Maximum R&B poster that used to advertise their Marquee Club shows.
There you go.
Back in the day.
Yeah, and so that's in my zine. Which zine was that? Satan Is My Father.
Yeah,
which I love having in there. We'll put a link to that too. So anyway, yeah, just to interject that you. Well, from an outsider's perspective, I mean, I think we, had seen you around New Year's and, you talked to us about your plan for doing these daily comics, and you hit this kind of escape velocity after, I don't know, a couple weeks, 2 months maybe, where when you look back at the whole collection, you hit your stride and you found your style, and it was so inspiring and so cool that it was, you had kind of jumped into this thing being like, I want to draw better, and then just the magic of doing it daily, you did start to draw better. I mean, again, not that the early ones were bad, but but just you found a way to your style became more defined.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I was spending so much time on these things because I had almost no life. So I would go to work, I would come home, I basically that year I watched every episode of Star Trek that existed at that time. I would come home, make some dinner, sit down in front of Star Trek on Netflix, and just draw. And I would draw until I was done, and I would scan it, and I would clean it up. I was spending 2 or 3 hours a day probably on these most of the time. Every once in a while, I was kind of pressed for time, and I would do something a little quicker. But I was really taking it very, very seriously. And again, the only reason I did was because I was getting feedback, and it became not that I would be disappointing my public if I didn't do it, but people are following this. I don't want to mess this up. I want to actually follow through. because it just felt good, and I was enjoying the journey, because it really was a journey, because I didn't know what I was doing. I don't claim any mastery now, but I have a better idea of what I'm going to do when I sit down with a pen and paper than I did then. And eventually I realized, well, if I'm going to do it every day, like if I'm going to go, I had like a couple of brief vacations. And I'm like, well, how am I going to, I know that when I'm traveling, I can't do that. So sometimes I would wind up doing 2 or 3 a day pre-travel, so that I could have them saved up so that I could post them still once a day. And I made it to December 31st, and I never missed a day posting. And that, for me, that more than anything else, that was just huge, because I never thought I could do something that monumental. Because again, no follow through, but I did it, and that was a really good sense of accomplishment.
And it was, yeah, you talk about the feedback that you were getting from social media, and it was so, I think it really went both ways, because I think that there was this sense among, people like me and Brian and others who were following you on social media, watching these go up every day. We were just cheering for you and being yes, Gene, do it. And I think that, yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the social media aspect of it, because I think you're one of the most uniquely good at social media people that I know. Like you use it in like really interesting ways, and also people just love you. I mean, you have so many people that follow you, and again, like, not to name names, but like these are big deal people like out in the world, like people that you will have heard of, that people follow you and get really, really psyched about the work that you're contributing. And so yeah, I was just glad that you brought that up, because I think that not that it's like some secret to your success or whatever, but there was a meaningful community rally around you, I think, as you were doing that, and especially in seeing the new designs and in seeing how your work was developing, that I just thought was really, really cool, and I was really happy for you, like when you did those 365 days.
Well, wow, thank you so much. That means a lot. I never thought of it in those terms. It was just it's art. It's very self-centered. This is the thing that I need to do. And basically it turned out I had to be doing that. Once it became a habit, again, I don't draw every day anymore because life, but I'm doing that year of basically schooling myself every single day. That was really important just to me to understand more what kinds of things I might want to do. And I did I did a collection or two of some of the best pages from those into a mini comic called Comics Machine. There are 2 issues of Comics Machine, and I did 2 more collections of things that came from that year, because I had a couple of things that worked that kind of lent themselves to a collection. They weren't exactly a narrative, but they had a similar style to them. So let's see. After that, the next year, I slowed down a bit. I didn't do a lot, but I mean, I put up some T-shirt designs on Zazzle, and I've never made enough to buy a single shirt myself, but but I put things out there. The mini comics went out and did pretty well, but then one summer day in 2015, I got this. At work, there was a vendor fair where like all the people who sell things to the university come in, and everybody goes and sees, well, what kind of swag can you get, and who publishes stuff for us, who could I get to make mugs, or just dumb stuff like that. But the printer who I used to print my first 2 comic books was a printer called Quartet, which I can't say enough good about them. But they were passing some things out, and some of them were just like little notebooks they had made like out of scrap paper. And I picked up one, and they're called Quartet. So the cover has just had a bunch of different Q's all over the place, just the letter Q everywhere. I took it back to my office, and at lunch I pulled it out, and I looked at the Q, and I put a little circle inside the middle Q on the cover of that thing. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I opened it, and I drew 1 page. And then I had another one of those things where it's like, okay, this looks like the start of something. I am going to do one complete story, again, quotation marks. In this book, it was like 63 pages or something like that. And when I get to the end, it's done. But this is not going to be a sketchbook of random stuff. This is going to be something that is somehow continuous. And started posting those. And that kind of became, people were interested in that as well. And I was giving myself all these challenges at this point. Like I figured out how many pages there were, so I knew how long every chapter was going to be. I was going to break down into chapters, and every chapter had certain things that had to happen in it visually. So I planned things out very elaborately, sort of in my head. Nothing concrete on content, just in sort of the style of the kinds of marks I was going to make for each chapter, because I just wanted something that looked like it felt like it all had some collective meaning somehow. And I didn't do it every day, but I did it almost every day. And I think it took me not quite 3 months to finish it. And I was like, you know what? I could make this into an actual book. And that became Qodèxx, because the Q from the cover became the critical design element. Every single page had something that looked like that Q, whether it was a character, not exactly, or a piece of text, or some fake architecture or whatever. And that became this book, and people were interested in it. And I got really lucky because a friend of mine, Karen Kring, who does a lot of local art stuff in Evanston and Chicago. I was walking somewhere one day, I forget where, and my phone rang, and it was Karen, and she said, I think we should do like a book launch for your book. We could do like a reading. And I said, well, number one, that's silly. It's just a comic. And then I said, also, how can I do a reading? Because this book has no language. All the text in it is not real language. But I said, let me think about it. And then there was a fateful car ride with you and Brian, where you were talking about the concert that you did. Could you just describe it? Because you can describe it better than I can.
Yeah. So at that time, I was singing with the Chicago Artists Chorale, and it was the spring. What? Yeah, was that 2016? When was that? I'm like blanking now.
2016.
2016. And so it was, it was the election season, and everyone was just, their brains were melting from all the commentary and the punditry and everything. And it's only gotten worse in the past 4 years. But our choral director, Tom Vendefredo, he said, okay, guess what? This concert is going to be no words. Everyone's sick of words. And so what if we just do a concert that has 0 words? And so that was cool. So like all the material that we were working on, for the most part, was vocalese and nonsense syllables and that kind of approach. And so, yeah, I was just very innocently sort of describing, what we were working on at the time. I was going to these weekly rehearsals, and then whose light bulb went off in their head first?
I think it was me. I can't guarantee, but I kind of think it was me, because I'm like, well, they want me to do a book reading. I said, but I can't do a reading. But if you're doing songs without words and I'm doing comics with fake text, what if we put the two together? What if I did like a slideshow of the book, and you and Brian performed some of those songs?
And so Brian, being Brian, who can never just do something casually, I
was expecting you guys just to do a few of the songs that you had done for that concert.
And that's, because Brian wasn't in the chorus with me or anything, and those were all, it was all like a lot of classical or sort of contemporary classical pieces and some pop stuff. But Brian was like, oh no, we're going to write original music for this. And so Brian composed a suite of what is it, like 5 or 6 songs, original songs?
Yeah.
And we tried to do it with vocalese style, where there were no words, and it just became like too much. It was like you needed something to ground the abstract comic. And so we do have words that I sing in it. But yeah, we wrote these 6 songs that were meant to sort of back up and accompany the imagery that you had created for the Qodèxx story, quote unquote story.
Yeah, and again, since I said every one of my chapters looks a little different in that book, you guys, the way the song structures work, they vaguely match up audibly what the pages look like. I got one chapter that's kind of that I just think of as the loud chapter, and the song that you guys created that hit that space kind of sounds like what those pages felt like to me. And you guys invited me to the first rehearsal, and I was like, words? Okay. I was a little disappointed.
Yeah, you were skeptical. You were skeptical.
I was like, that's not what we talked about, man. This is totally different. But as you guys were playing, and I mean, the music is just phenomenal, and your voice is heaven. But as I'm listening to it, I realized, no, this is better. This is better, because to make an audience sit there for 20 minutes, looking at something they can't read, hearing something that doesn't make any sense, that's asking a lot. But with these songs, it feels like they could maybe be describing, but they totally don't describe what's on the page at all. They're again more about feeling. So I thought of it as like, really, I call your soundtrack the concrete life preserver, because it looks like for an audience who's like, I don't understand this book. Here's songs with words. Oh, now I'm going to understand it. So it's like a life preserver, but it doesn't explain anything. So you just sink with it, and you sink deeper into everything. So and we wound up doing that, and we turned that into a fundraiser for one of my colleagues is from Kenya, and she's building a library in her home village. And so it turned into a literacy fundraiser, and I was like, and that was fantastic to be able to do that. And I was like, we're raising money for literacy with a book that has no words. And the irony of that, I liked a lot.
And, yeah, it was just delicious.
Yeah, and the event went really well. You guys were fantastic.
Yeah, because then what we ended up doing was that, like, yeah, you had converted all of your drawings into like a slideshow that you had timed, where it was like, a second or two per slide, and you projected them on the projector, and then Brian and I sort of played live. So it's kind of like how Jim Jarmusch and I forget who he plays with as Squirrel, where they do their sort of music concrete soundtracks to old silent films and stuff like that. So it was we were sort of live accompanying the slideshow of your comics panels as they sort of evolved and went slide by slide.
Yeah, and it was you and a drum and a little mixer to mess with your voice for a couple places, which was really cool. And Brian sitting on the ground, surrounded by 3 guitars and 11 effects pedals.
And I think 4 amps at that first show.
Yeah. Yeah, and so people looked; they had no idea what was going on. But we had a really nice turnout, and the people really, I think, tuned into things just because it wasn't just looking at the pictures. The music really kind of drove things along. It became sort of an event, a happening. We were calling
a happening.
We were kind of tongue-in-cheek, at least I thought it was tongue-in-cheek, calling it a happening before it occurred. Little did I know that you and Brian were doing research into happenings, like the happenings in the New York art scene in the 60s and 70s and stuff like that, and really consciously thinking about it in those terms.
Yeah, like the stuff that would happen at the factory with Andy Warhol, and all that sort of downtown New York, really freaky, weird art stuff. We, read a little bit about, and we're putting it in our brains. And so, yeah, we were very intentional about okay, we're going to call this a happening, then we're going to damn well give you a happening.
Yeah, and I mean, it went really well. We've done it 2 more times since then. Once at a conference in Dartmouth, at a graphic novel conference in Dartmouth, which was a lot of fun. That's where Brian was an undergraduate, and we got to come back and blow their minds. because it was a kind of a graduate student heavy conference, and the morning papers that the people were giving were very kind of highly theoretical and stuff like this. Then we all went to lunch, but then the three of us, especially you two, cut out of lunch a little early. And so when everybody came back from lunch, suddenly there were all these guitars and a drum up in front next to the screen, and they're like, "What is going on?" And so we kind of did it again, but with more explanation. Especially you guys kind of gave a presentation about where all this came from, and I think they didn't know a lot of them didn't know what to make of it, but some people thought it was a lot of fun.
Well, and it was also, one of those funny things for me because, like, I'm kind of like, there's no reason that I should be giving an academic talk at a conference at Dartmouth. That was like really kind of fun and funny for me. It's like just slipping into places where I don't truly belong. It always is sort of delightful to me, and that was like I felt especially sort of like secret spy, like ha ha ha, they let me in.
Oh, great! No, it was so cool. And I mean, every time we've done it, we've done it a little differently. We still have to do the acoustic one.
Yeah, sepia Qodèxx.
Yeah, the sepia Qodèxx. Yeah, but I mean,
we'll find a place for it. Yeah, we got to do it.
yeah. So I mean that, and then you guys, the soundtrack is up on SoundCloud, and there's a CD of it now, and it's like we can sell a book and record set, like the Power Records things, or like the Disney books that we had when we were little. When Tinkerbell rings her little bell, you will turn the page. So you can buy the book and record set.
Yeah, we'll put links to that in the show notes as well for people if they're interested.
Yeah,
still got some copies left, and yeah, and the downloadable files are up on our Bandcamp.
Yeah, so that was the last big thing that I did. I got myself a iPad Pro, so now I've been working digitally. Which is totally different. So I'm kind of relearning things again, but I was able to put something up. I was asked to do a comic for an online poetry magazine, Court Green.
Oh yeah, that's right.
By Tony Trujillo, and that was like, okay, I have to do something that's several screens long because it's going to be on the computer, but not in print. So it's like, okay, so I had to think about something like that, and I played with color and I played with pacing and stuff like that in a way that I had never done before because that was too hard to do with one brush and paper. So that's been fun, and I guess more recently I've been building things rather than drawing them so much. I mentioned at the beginning that I was doing. I was taking some classes to become. I mean, I'm a graduate student again for a library degree. And this fall, I took a course in bookbinding where every week we would build one or more books by hand. This use of stitching, cutting, gluing, assembling, pressing, all this kind of stuff like that. And that is a lot of fun. It's something I've always wanted to do. And this gave me an excuse to actually do it. And I tried to bring the comics into it a little bit. There wasn't a lot of until the end, there wasn't a whole place for a whole lot of inserting yourself into it. It was more like learning how to do the stuff, which is important. But we did one that was a tunnel book, which is like you kind of open it like an accordion and you look down through it. And that one, I kind of used Qodèxx imagery in that one, and that was fun. And then for the final project, we could do whatever we wanted. And so I did a modified carousel book, which is like this kind of 3-layer, not a pop-up, it's like a pop-in sort of thing with like several different scenes. And I decided what I wanted to do is I really love Steve Ditko's work on Doctor Strange. And I found one issue from 1965 that I actually have a really beat-up copy of the original comic because I really love the Ben-Day dots and all the different colors and things like that. So I scanned several of the kind of like otherworldly environments. If you've seen the movie Doctor Strange, it's kind of like that, only it's much cooler in print. And so I decided I wanted to like take these environments, which always felt 3D to me, and really do them what I thought was paying tribute to it, and doing it that way. And so it was like a 7-panel thing or something like that. And then I realized that these are really kind of abstract shapes, basically. Could I make this more like a comic, because I didn't want people in it. I didn't want word balloons or anything, but it's like, how does this become mine? And then I thought about my comics with the Asemic text that doesn't really mean anything. And in another issue, there's a scene where Doctor Strange is reading a scroll with incantations on it. And the incantations are represented by these glyphs, which have no meaning. And I was like, that's the thing. So I scanned that panel, blew it up really big, chopped out all the letters, and I built little word type things out of them. And what I did was I added those to the book, but instead of the words being part of one of the 3 layers of images, I found a book on how to do pop-up books, and I made these little pop-up signs. So they look like captions for every panel that look like titles or just captions. But again, so you're looking at images that have no concrete meaning really, and something that looks like text, but it's not representative text at all. It is Asemic text. So basically, I did another one of my things for that. That was my final project for the class, and I made a video in which I forgot to smile because I was done with the book. I was like, oh, but let me make a video of it. So I made a video of myself opening the book up. I put that on Facebook, and boom, I think it wound up getting like 5,000 or 6,000 views on Facebook alone, which
it was huge. That day you put it up, it was enormous.
It was again, it's the closest I've ever been to being like sort of viral, and it was really cool. But again, I didn't do it to go viral. I just did it because this was an assignment, and people were like, "Can we buy one?" And I'm like, "This is my final project for a class. This is homework. This is not a thing to buy. This is homework.
This is homework.
This is literally homework." But I really enjoyed that. I wound up taking my professor told me that if I was interested in pop-ups, there's somebody in Chicago named Sean Sheehy who does pop-ups. He's a book artist, and he specializes in movable books, pop-ups. And he said sometimes he does workshops. You should check it out. And I said, thank you. And I found his website, and it turned out that Sunday, he was doing an all-day pop-up book workshop about a 30-minute walk from my apartment.
That's amazing.
Like, are you kidding me? It was like it couldn't have come at a. It was like such like it was fate. And I went to that, and we made like an 8-page pop-up book of little tiny things. It was near Halloween, so one of them's a bat and things. But it was fascinating. And now I haven't drawn a lot, but I'm planning out more books. I want to build more. I want to do more actual pop-up stuff too. I did another one after that class. I took the very first Peanuts comic strip. Here comes Charlie Brown, good old Charlie Brown, yes sir, good old Charlie Brown, how I hate him, which is the very first Peanuts comic strip from October 2nd, 1950, 2nd or 3rd, something like that. And I did another book like I did of the Doctor Strange one, where I just had a couple of pop-ups, but I did it like the weekend after Thanksgiving, and just because I wanted to do it, and I put that one up. And it took a couple of days, but then that one took off. And then a couple weeks later, it took off again when a cartoonist in Germany reshared the thing on Twitter, when it just bumped up also. Again, lots of good feedback on that. There should be more news on that one, hopefully soon. ... Exactly. I've started doing the layout for the next book, which I'm not ready to talk about yet. But I also need to go back and do some more drawing too, because the next one is another adaptation of something. But after that, I want to try to do something with my own artwork in it again. But I've got the itch to build things now, because that course because I learned so much in that course, and I enjoyed it. I worked my butt off. Like the first week or two, I did like 2 or 3 versions of every book because I didn't want any mistakes. So I did way too much work. And spent a lot of money at Blick's art supply store on more paper than I should have needed, but I did need it because I needed things to look just so. So I'm interested in interested in doing that kind of stuff now too. It's not just not just cartooning, not just building, but I'm kind of thinking more lines of artist books now. I want to. Doing a mass-produced thing like when I went to Quartet Printing for the mini comics, that's all fun. I like that a lot. But right now, I really want to build things a little more and just like have every single inch of this thing be the thing that I did.
And which I think is such a continuity, with, I mean, you may or may not think of it this way, but with your early scholarship is, you were always so interested in the architecture of the page and fonts and stuff like that. And I just love what a unique yet sort of logical progression that is for your line of thinking, going from thinking of it, you go from comics that you maybe bought at the store and, like you said, were mass produced elsewhere, but then you're taking that through line and interpreting it through your own work into these objets, which I think is just such a cool way to carry that theme forward for yourself.
Yeah, and actually, as you were talking, what I just realized was that my dissertation was going to be on illuminated manuscripts, handmade, one-of-a-kind items. And guess what I'm doing now?
Interesting how we catch up with ourselves, right?
Yeah, they look nothing like medieval manuscripts. The techniques are all different, but there's a concept there's a continuity there as well that I hadn't really considered. Because again, even though medieval manuscripts are one of a kind, usually they were copies, because before printing, if you wanted another copy of another book, somebody had to print out every single letter on vellum until another copy of the text was created. And so each one of those every one of those manuscripts is in a sense a kind of adaptation, because they've got a source text and then they're recreating it. But whenever you recreate something, it can't be an exact copy. So there's always some sort of interpretation, some kind of change into it. And that's kind of what I've been doing so far with these movable books, is taking a pre-existing text and representing it for people. So yeah,
and also,
God, I can't believe it. I've gone straight back to that.
Well, and I think the thing that underlies both, the medieval manuscripts that were hand copied and your sort of continual return to this form is it's the love, right? I mean, it's like the love that people put into their love of spirit or their religion or in cases of illuminated manuscripts that were used in a religious context,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't spend that much time and attention on something that you don't love. And I feel like you love books and love comics in a way that no one else I know does. Like and I mean that as a compliment, like in a really, really beautiful way. I mean, that's just such a defining feature of what animates your life. And yeah, and I love seeing you find new ways to bring that out.
Thank you. It's interesting, and yeah, if you look around my apartment, I basically have decorated in books every square inch. And now I've been picking up more pop-up books lately too. Some of these things are amazing. So I'm not aspiring to anything on that level, but I'm looking at them as a kind of inspiration now. To think about if I want to make this kind of a movement, how does that get done? And I'm trying to thinking in 3 dimensions is different than thinking in a simple 2-dimension drawing. So I'm thinking about layers. I'm thinking about movement in ways that I wasn't and didn't need to when I was doing the comics. I mean, 2D drawing is all about creating the illusion of depth sometimes and things like that. And I would try to do that, but now I can actually play with that on a concrete level. And it's kind of like moving from chess to 3D chess. It's like suddenly there's that whole Z-axis to play with now that I had never considered before. And again, just cutting paper with a knife is a lot of fun sometimes. It can be really a pain. I just bought a lamp with a giant magnifying glass built into it because some of that stuff gets really, really tiny. And that's totally my fault, but if I want it to look good, that's what I'm going to do. So yeah, I've gone from somebody who doesn't follow through to somebody who's obsessing.
Well, I think it works for you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a really strange journey. Like you said, it doesn't there's continuity, but I'm doing things right now that I never even dreamed about doing. I just never even considered it. When I was really little, I drew a lot. I was like the class artist usually in grade school and stuff like that. But eventually I put that away because I was going to be a scientist. Ha ha ha. That didn't work. But
library science, you're getting close.
Yeah, it's true. That's true. Yeah. Now, God, another full circle thing. But yeah, I mean, when I was little, I would try to draw comics, and there were like 2 or 3 that I remember starting, and I never ever finished one. I would try to do stories, and I would never ever finish them. Whereas my younger brother John he just started making books before he could spell or even write. So he would draw things, and he would have Mom usually write the text underneath the words, and he would staple them together, and he was making books. And he started doing comics. He did like a 30 or 40 issue series over the course of a few years when he was a kid. And it's like, he can do this. I don't need to do this anymore. And so it's I had the impulse before, but I didn't know what to do with it, and I couldn't stick with it. But now I've by working on smaller chunks, instead of saying I'm going to write a 32-page comic book right now, it's like I'm going to make 1 page and see what that looks like. And eventually that 1 page grows into a 64-page book. But you just have to. It's weird. It's just like you said. I'm surrounded by books. I love books, and now I know how to make books in a way that I didn't before. So I'm just. That's what I'm doing.
That's amazing. So for people who want to follow along with what you're doing, do you want to tell everyone where you are on the socials, where they can check out your work and follow along as you create these masterpieces?
Well, thanks. If you go to comicsmachine.com, that will take you to my Tumblr, which is I haven't put as much up there as I needed to lately, but it's got all the original comics and a lot of stuff and some news things like that. But that doesn't get updated immediately usually. On Instagram and Twitter, I'm Gene KJR, GeneKJR, and Facebook too. So basically, if you put in Gene KJR in anywhere, eventually it will take you to me. But again, yeah, we can add the links in the show notes also. But yeah, and if you do the Instagram, you're not going to get my drawings. You're going to get a lot of other crap too. But if you're interested just in the drawings, it's comicsmachine.com is the best place to go. And
awesome.
And that has links to a lot of the Qodèxx stuff and other things.
And places where you can buy the comics too for people who are interested. Yeah.
Yeah, there are still some copies of some of the older stuff, but I need to make more print stuff. So that's another thing that is in the back of my head. But right now I have to build before I can mass produce.
I love it. Well, Gene, thank you so much for being on the show today. This was just a wonderful conversation. I was looking forward to it anyway, just knowing what a great conversationalist you are and just what a fascinating person you are and fascinating life you've lived. And so I was really looking forward to hearing it all in your own words.
Oh, well, thank you. And this is just a great idea for a podcast also, just following people's journeys. I mean, for the episodes that I've heard so far, it's fascinating to see just how people progress. And again, and a lot of you comes through all these also because you've got a connection to the people, but we learn as much about your journey in different ways each episode too. And I think that's also great.
Awesome. Well, thank you for saying that. So hopefully this will be edifying to one and all as the spider's out its way into the world. So thanks again so much, Gene.
Thank you.
As I mentioned in the story about the presentation that Gene, Brian, and I gave at the Dartmouth Illustration, Comics, and Animation Conference in 2018, it always kind of makes me laugh to show up in spaces where I don't, quote, like, belong. And that's a quality I get to experience pretty often being in Gene's orbit. He truly is one of the OG American comic scholars. I can't emphasize his importance to and influence on the field enough. So it's just been a super fun experience for me to get a little glimpse through him into the world of comic scholarship, but then also access to like the cutting edge of current comics makers, particularly the loose scene that's sprung up in Evanston, Illinois. So if you'd also like to keep up with Gene's orbit, you can find him online at comicsmachine.com. And from there, you can also link out to his Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter accounts, and also to the hugely important early website, comicsresearch.org. As for me, I so appreciate everyone who's been listening and subscribing to and otherwise supporting this podcast. It's truly a joy to share these episodes with you. Between episodes, you can always find me online at queenofpeaches.com and intermittently on the socials as well. Bye for now.